I finished a book on writing that I thought would feel like a warm hug, but instead I just felt lukewarm about it. If You Want to Write by Brenda Ueland was published in 1938, and it's on so many lists of books writers are told that they have to read. Like, so many lists. I finished it and thought, yeah, that was nice. A bit of the same, but felt good. And then I spent about a week arguing with it in my head, which isn't what you do with a book you didn't care about. So this video is about that argument, because working out what I disagreed with is how I found out what I actually think of it. It's also about an exercise from the book that I did that surprised me. I came out of that hour feeling calmer than I felt in weeks, and I'm still not entirely sure how to incorporate that exercise into my routine moving forward. But first, what this book is actually about. Ueland opens with a claim that she repeats throughout the book. Know that you have talent, you are original, and have something important to say. Not that you might have some talent or that you could develop some, but know that you do have talent. It's in her very first chapter, and it's the very first line of her closing summary, and everything in between is her arguing you into believing it. When she wrote this, she was talking to everybody. She lived in Minneapolis and was teaching writing in different community settings around the city, not to professionals, but rather to ordinary people, to housewives and housemaids, to businessmen and tradesmen, to people who had at some point in their lives been told that they weren't creative, and these people believed it. She's talking to people who are frightened, and she's relentless about her belief in their talent, saying, don't be ashamed of what you wrote before, and don't sit there measuring yourself against other writers. Don't be afraid of writing something bad. She even told a class to just go out there and write the worst story possible they could on purpose, and she offered $10 at the time to anybody who managed to write something that was terrible through and through, and nobody could. She lived to 93 and published something like 6 million words, and she said there were only 2 rules she lived by: to tell the truth and to not do anything she didn't want to do. And these are what the whole book is about. Tell the truth. Don't write to sound clever. Don't write to sound literary. Don't write for a version of a reader you've invented in your head. Write the way you actually think, in the words you actually use. And if you just happen to think in really long, elaborate sentences, then write those. They're yours. Be careless, be reckless, be a lion, be a pirate. Reading this gave me a sense of deja vu. And then it clicked. Anne Lamott says it, Natalie Goldberg says it, Stephen King says it in books that I've already made videos about. Decades apart in completely different registers, these 3 key books on the craft land on the same instruction: stop performing. Write what's actually true, even when writing fiction and fantasy, maybe especially so. Which made me wonder why it's something that we need to hear repeated so many times before it sinks in, before we believe it. And more than that, why I needed to hear it again at this stage in my practice, because logically, I know this. I've said it on this channel, and I'll catch myself writing a sentence with somebody else's approval sitting in the back of my mind. And that's not what they're saying we should work towards. So what keeps stopping me? Here's where I've landed. It's not that we've forgotten how to write the truth and how to write truthfully, but rather it's that it's getting harder and harder to find out what we think underneath all of the noise and everything that's being poured in. Something's always telling us what to feel or flooding our senses. You know, social media does it, the news does it, films, shows, magazines, the people we follow, the people who we don't follow but who we see anyway. So many things come in telling you how you're meant to react, what you're meant to think, you know, with opinions reassembled and ready for you to borrow. And most of it isn't even bad, or at least a lot of it isn't. It's just constant, and it's very, very good at its job. It's very good at convincing you how you should think about things. And then you sit down to write something true, and you're not even sure what of these things that are going around in your head are actually yours, and what's just from stuff that you've taken in. Ueland is writing in 1938 with no phone buzzing in her pocket, no feed comparing her to anybody, and no algorithm to please. She has newspapers and magazines and the radio and the opinions of the people who are standing near her, and yet she's already worried about this. Her answer to this is idleness. Not rest exactly, she means time alone with nothing coming in. She calls it moodling, and she lists all the kind of things that count. Walking alone for a long time, taking a dreamy hour to get dressed, or lying in bed and letting thoughts just come and go, or digging in the garden, or driving somewhere with nobody else in the car and no radio playing, or just sewing or playing the piano, different things with your hands where you're engaged, but then you can let your mind wander. At such times, she says, you're being slowly filled and recharged with warm imagination. She's convinced that the writing you managed to do today comes out of the idle time you had yesterday. And I find that really lovely. In this noisy world, that quiet is something that I crave. And then partway through this chapter, she just stops and she draws a line and she says, not all of it counts. If your idleness is a slump, worrying, fretting, indecision, then that's out. Don't do it. She says it's bad, terrible, and utterly sterile. And she gets harsher from there. She judges people who fill their time taking in all sorts of printed bilge like detective stories and newspapers. That, she says, is uncreative. And this is where my hackles rose. I don't like this approach. I don't like this sort of snobbery and judgment. Detective stories and newspapers in 1938 were what ordinary tired people would read at the end of a long day. And that judgment it hasn't aged well. And it's something that I refuse to carry on. I read light books. I watch TV. I binge shows. I have a chronic illness and a life that doesn't run according to a schedule. And there are evenings where what I want is a rom-com and some food delivered straight to the door and couch time. And those evenings are not a lapse. They're a person resting, and people are allowed to rest. But more than that, so many of the things she judges are stories. Taking them in is part of how we refill the creative well, and they're the ingredients that we create with. So I'm not going to judge how I choose to rest and be idle, and I'll ask you not to judge your own. I'll simply put these things in her second life rule, saying, do what you want. The one thing I would add, and I think this is the useful half of what she's reaching for, is that there's a difference between filling the well, resting intentionally, and letting the tap just flood your mind. So choose the film, choose the book, watch that YouTube video or scroll TikTok for a certain amount of time because you want to. Sit down to do something because you want it and be present for it. Even if that's just couch potato mode. That isn't the same as 3 hours of scrolling you didn't decide on and can't remember afterwards. Not because one is noble and the other one is shameful, but because one of them you chose and the other one you spiraled into and lost track of. And I think you need both. I think you need time where you deliberately fill up and then some stretches where nothing is coming in at all so you can hear what's actually yours. I spent years building this writing routine and I never once planned for the second one. The first one would just arrive on its own because it does constantly, and I just assumed that the quiet would find a gap, but it never did. So I made one. There's an exercise Ueland talks about in the books, and it's simple. Sit with a pen and paper and quietly put down whatever you happen to be thinking. That's it. Not focusing on making a to-do list of your day or writing morning pages or writing your book or focusing on anything in particular, just whatever passes through, including the parts that are boring. And I gave this an hour. No manuscript in front of me, no music filling the air, no goal beyond being there with the page. The first 10 minutes were so uncomfortable in this fidgety kind of way. I kept wanting to check something, to do something, to just be somewhere else and just to get on with it. I even kept asking Siri how long was left on the timer. So I wrote that down. I wrote that I was uncomfortable and that I didn't know what to write. And then I felt this discomfort ease. I started feeling a lot more present. What came afterwards was mundane. It was my day. It was the things that I'm thinking about, the small, unremarkable parts that make up a life. And then without deciding to, the writing turned existential. The way the light was reflecting off a mirror turned into thoughts about life and death and everything that's weighing on me lately. And my thinking had nowhere else to go. So it just kept going deeper and deeper. And I kept writing down what I was seeing and what I was feeling. And not one word of it was about my manuscript. I'm 85-ish thousand words into a book. And I sat down for an hour to write. And I had the freedom to write about anything at all. and the book didn't come up once. So if you're here for a technique to unblock your draft, this didn't do it for me. It might do it for you, but it didn't do it for me. But I stood at the end of that hour feeling calmer than I felt in weeks. Not productive, not inspired, calm. Like something that I had been carrying had been set down. About an hour after that, I was tired again and my head was full and my shoulders felt heavy. So stopping at calmer than I felt in weeks would make a much tidier video, but the truth is that sense of calm didn't last. I hadn't realized how much comes up in an ordinary day. Not one thing in particular, it's just this constant flow of things refilling the sense of calm without me actually choosing most of it or any of it. I only noticed because for a moment, it was quiet. And so, I don't know. This isn't a quick fix. It's a practice. It's closer to an exercise routine than to fixing something and having it stay fixed forever. And finding the sense of idleness that let the imagination flourish doesn't have to come from writing in a notebook. The notebook was just Ueland's favorite. She would describe sitting down to think and getting nothing and giving up and going downstairs to do something menial and having, in her words, wonderful, fascinating, extraordinary, original, illuminating thoughts. Walking counts, time in the garden counts. The form isn't the point. What matters is that nothing is coming in and your mind is allowed to go wherever it wants. Ueland could tell people to be idle and trust that idleness would come up. In 1938, quiet was the default and stimulation was the interruption, but for us, it's the other way around. Quiet is the thing you have to build. So I'm not going to hand you a rule. I'm not going to tell you that the evening you spend watching something is time you should have spent staring at a wall. The rest, however you want, I'll be doing the same. What I'd say instead is smaller. Take a breather from the inflow, even if it's only while you're doing other things like folding the laundry, and then make something to help you find out what you think. The writing, the hour with a notebook, the walk where you argue with yourself are spaces where your own voice gets to be the loudest thing in the room and where whatever is underneath, all this clutter and noise gets a chance to surface, which is why 4 writers across 60 years all had to say the same thing and why it needs to be said again and again right now. Write truthfully, write recklessly, and give yourself space to uncover that true voice. Ueland spent a whole book insisting that everybody is original if they tell the truth, and I think she was right about that. I think she was wrong about how hard it is to get to the truth or how much grace people deserve while they're trying. This week it cost me an hour to get to some sort of truth, and 10 minutes of it were incredibly unpleasant. And for the first time in a long time, the only voice in my head was my own. So if you try it, come and tell me what showed up for you. And I'll see you next week. Happy writing.